Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at another rendition of Welt, sieh, hier, dein, Leben, which translates to O world, see your life here. Fairly straightforward chorale. I'd say it's even more straightforward than yesterday's rendition. You should check out that video if you want to compare and contrast the differences between the two chorales, but really not too much to write home about. I'd say really the big takeaway is a little bit of a unique progression that happens here at the end of the chorale, but other than that, fairly straightforward. Let's hop into the analysis. So we have three sharps in the key signature. We start on A major and we end on A major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is A major, just like yesterday's. Passing tones here in the lower voices before we get D, F sharp, and A, which is our 4-chord D major. Passing tones in the lower voices here before we get B, D, F sharp, and B. You could analyze this as a 2-chord, but I think this is actually G sharp, B, and D, which would make this G sharp diminished in first inversion. 4 going to 7/6, much more normative progression. I think this F sharp is sort of like the opposite of a suspension in terms of the resolution, the direction of the resolution, that is. And then we have A, E, A, and C sharp, which is our tonic and root position. We also have some passing tone, or we have some passing tones. We have a passing tone in the melody before we go to C sharp, A, E, and E. This A is also a chord tone that just makes this an A major chord in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Our cadence is an imperfect authentic cadence. We started off with B, A, F sharp, and D, which is B minor 7 root position. That's a 2/7 chord. That takes us to E7, E, G sharp, E, and D. It's an incomplete 7 chord, but a 7 chord nonetheless. And then we have A, E, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad and root position, just like yesterday's cadence. And if I'm not mistaken, this is just like yesterday's cadence as well. We have somewhat of an ambiguous cadence here. It's either a half cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence, and I think there's an argument for both, but I'm going to err on the side of this being a half cadence, namely because the D sharp is only really pertinent right before the dominant chord, and this G sharp feels like it wants to resolve up to A rather than going down to E. Unlike its, I guess, like companion phrase, which is the penultimate phrase here, where this G sharp feels like it wants to resolve down to E. So they're different even though they sound similar. But starting the phrase off, we have another A major chord, A, E, A, and C sharp. We have some passing tones in the outer voices before we get C sharp, E, A, and E, which is again our tonic triad, this time in first inversion, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral, just change the figure bass. A little neighbor tone here in the alto before we get another A major over C sharp, E, A, and E, no need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the bass and the alto, this is not really a neighbor tone, it's more of an escape tone because it doesn't step back down in the opposite direction, it skips down. A little minute detail there. And then we get E major, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord. We also have some passing tones in the inner voices here before we get A, C sharp, E, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad and root position. Passing 7th on the bass, passing tone in the melody before we get F sharp, C sharp, E, and A. Very similar structurally to what's happening here in the first cadence, where instead of 2/7 we have 6/7, and then we have B, D sharp, and A, which is an incomplete 5/7 chord, but this is actually 5/7 of 5 because B is the dominant of E and E is our 5, and that takes us to our 5 chord, E, B, E, and G sharp. Of course, if you were analyzing this in the key of E major, this would be a 2/7, 5/7, 1 progression, which could be what Bach was going for here in terms of creating that contrast between the two phrases. All in all, I think this, I'm really driven to the melody in terms of, or driven, I'm drawn, that's what I was trying to say, drawn to the melody in terms of where my harmonic analysis is going, and if this feels like it's not going to resolve down to E, I don't feel like we've modulated. And we only have one leading tone here, so it feels like it's functioning more like a secondary dominant to me, but they're both valid analyses, whether you analyze it in E or whether you analyze it in A like I did. Next phrase ends in a half cadence. Really no debate about this one. This is a half cadence in the key of A major. We start off with another E major chord, E, G sharp, B, and E, the passing seventh on the bass. Then we have C sharp, A, E, and A, which is 1-6, A major over C sharp, neighbor tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, and then we get C sharp, D, G sharp, and B. I reckon the C sharp's an accented non-chord tone. It's actually this B that is the implied bass, which would make this G sharp diminished over B, 7-6. And we know when we see this progression here, we typically expect a tonic triad in root position on the other side, at least the majority of the time. A, E, A, and C sharp. This pattern is very common in Bach, where we have two chords here that have a shared Roman numeral. They're just separated by an inversion, and the gap is bridged by a chord that is a diatonic step below in first inversion, or a diatonic step above in root position. It depends, but the majority of the time it's like this, so like 1-7-1 or 2-1-2, something like that. Off the harmonic rhythm we have D, G sharp, and B, almost like there's a little passing seventh chord happening in the upper voices here, but with the A in the bass it's not really analyzable, but the chord's definitely being implied. We then have another A major chord, A, E, A, and C sharp, no need to reanalyze. And then we have four voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here, which typically implies that there is some type of subdivided chord progression going on here, and that would make this B minor over D, which is 2-6. And that takes us to E major, E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5-chord half cadence. So this next phrase in yesterday's chorale modulated to the key of the relative minor, but here we don't. We stay in the key of A major, which is an interesting comparative or point of comparison between the two chorales. We then have C sharp, E sharp, G sharp, and C sharp, which is C sharp major with a passing seventh here. I think it's a passing seventh. Yeah, it's a passing seventh in the melody. That's the dominant of F sharp minor, which is 5 of 6 in the key of A major, and we would expect that to resolve to F sharp minor, which it does. We have F sharp, we have C sharp, we have F sharp, and we have A, our 6th chord, with a neighbor tone here in the tenor, and then we have G sharp, C sharp, E, and B. I think this C sharp's an accented non-chord tone here. You could analyze this as maybe 3-4-3 C sharp minor 7 over G, but I think this is actually a E major over G sharp. I mixed E and G sharp together, so 6 going to 5-6, which if you remember yesterday's chorale, this was a pretty pertinent chord progression. We saw it quite a bit, and we would expect that to resolve to A major, A, E, and C sharp, tonic triad, root position. We have some non-chord tones on the end of the beat here, where we have B, A, D, and D, which is kind of like a 2-chord, like a 2-7 chord B minor 7, but it's happening in passing and it's incomplete, so that sort of breaks my personal rule for what makes it onto the page, but you definitely could analyze a 2-7 chord there and that would be valid. We then have an A chord, A, C sharp, and E, no need to reanalyze. Passing seventh in the bass here, and as we're getting ready for our imperfect authentic cadence, we have kind of an interesting take on the authentic cadence. With imperfect authentic cadences, there's more variety in terms of Bach's writing. You see different permutations of tonic and dominant chords, whereas in perfect authentic cadences, it's usually the same sort of grab bag of chordal combinations. Here we have F sharp, A, C sharp, and D, which is D major 7 over F sharp, that's 4-6-5. B is a non-chord tone, F sharp is a chord tone, A is a chord tone, and then B turns into what's happening on the next beat, E, F sharp, B, and D. Or sorry, G sharp, F sharp, B, and D. I'm going to analyze this as G sharp minor 7 flat 5. However, if you look at this as a 7/6 suspension over the bass, sometimes, and it's actually very common that we see this, where Bach plays with the idea of 7/7 versus 5/6/5. If you hear this E as the root of the chord, or the result of this suspension being resolved down by step, this would be a 5/6/5 chord. E would be the root. If you look at the G sharp as the root, this would be G sharp minor 7 flat 5. They're really the same chord. I think this is one of those suspensions that it's interesting because we have two analyzable chords, whether or not you take the suspension into consideration. But either way, they function the same and they're basically the same pitch content. So yeah, I'm going to call it 7/7, but 5/6/5 is also totally valid, equally as valid, I would say. And that takes us to A major, A, E, A, and C sharp, our tonic triad. Next phrase takes us to the key of E major, ends in an imperfect authentic cadence, and I think these two phrases, in terms of my analysis, are the real point of contrast, where they end very similarly, but based on the prevalence of D sharp happening in the phrase, this one feels like a modulation to E major, whereas this one feels like maybe there might be a modulation to E major, but it's not for sure, at least in my ears. You definitely can hear it that way. Like I analyzed here, there's some ambiguity, but it's up to you. So we start the phrase off with F sharp minor, F sharp, A, and C sharp, which is our 6th chord, passing tone in the melody, G sharp, E, B, and E. It's a 5/6 chord. Remember, this progression is making a comeback. It was a lot more prevalent earlier in the chorale in yesterday's rendition, but today we're seeing it in the latter half. Then we have A, which is a non-chord tone, C sharp is a non-chord tone. That takes us to G sharp, B, B, and E, which is another 5/6 chord. No need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto. Then we have E, B, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord in root position, 5/3. I think this sort of starts the point in which, actually no, we could say that the modulation happens as early as the beginning of the phrase, but I don't think there's anything inherently more E major-like about this phrase than it being A major-like. It's actually the phrase avoids the use of D until we get to this D sharp here, which I think is interesting. At least I'm just trying to do some quick calculation here. Yeah, I don't see any other Ds except for this one right here, so probably you could mark the modulation as early as the beginning of this measure right here. But we have F sharp, we have A, we have F sharp, and we have B, which is kind of like an incomplete B minor 7 chord or a B7 chord. We don't have the D there to know. And then we have E, G sharp, and C sharp, which actually starts this idea of seeing C sharp in place of E major. So we're going to call this a 3 chord in the key of A major, and we're going to call it our 6 chord, 3 chord in the key of A major, and we're going to call this our 6 chord in the key of E major, where this D sharp, F sharp, G, and B gives us a G sharp minor 7 chord over D sharp, which would be 3, 4, 3, kind of like how we saw earlier. Here there's really no alternative in terms of calling it 5/6, but we would expect a 5 chord here, but the fact that it's happening off of the harmonic rhythm and it's happening in passing, this chord is definitely not getting as much stress, but typically we would expect this to be like an A rather than a G sharp, so that's really the difference between the two chords. It's only like a whole step. Or half step, I guess, in this case. Okay, next beat is C sharp, E, G sharp, and A, which again sort of draws a point of comparison between the two phrases here, the one at the beginning of the system and the one here in the middle of the system. This is A major 7 over C sharp, which is 4/6/5. C sharp, yeah, if it's the same here, it would be up a 6, which would make it C sharp. F sharp is a non-chord tone, and E is a chord tone, so we're seeing very similar structure between these two phrases. Then we have D sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, which again is another minor 7 flat 5 chord 7 7, or if you hear this B as the root of the chord, it could be 5 6. So really, the structure of this chorale is actually very interesting because we have two similar phrases here, and we have two similar phrases here, which are sort of bridged by a half cadence. So we have sort of this binary form where we have an A section with two A's, like A and A prime and B, and then we have a B section with like C, C, and D. So that's sort of like two somewhat symmetrical sides. Definitely points of symmetry between the two halves of the chorale. But after our 7-7 chord, we cadence on E major, E, B, E, and G sharp, tonic triad, root position. Last phrase takes us to the key of A major, ends in a perfect authentic cadence, the only perfect authentic cadence in this chorale. And we start the phrase off with C sharp minor, C sharp, E, and E, which is our 6th chord in the key of E major, and in the key of A major, it is our 3 chord. And the main reason why I say that this is, I'm going to take that back. I'm going to say that there's nothing really inherently more A major-like about calling the modulation there. Oh, actually, no. I'm going to walk that back again because we have D natural in passing here. So yeah, I do think this is the point where we modulate to A, and this is our 3 chord. I was looking at this point and thinking about it while I was talking, and I'm like, why did I mark the modulation here and not on the first beat of the first complete measure of the phrase? And it's because we have D natural. We didn't have that problem in this phrase here. In fact, we had the opposite problem, which was, where does the modulation happen when there are no D sharps and we have nothing really to compare A major to E major? So I waited until we started to see D sharps, whereas here we have a D natural right off the bat, which tells us probably we're in the key of A major at this point, and we're seeing a point of we're seeing a shift from D sharp to D natural, which indicates to us that we have modulated. At least it indicates to me. You might have your reasons as well. But 3 takes us to F sharp minor, F sharp, A, C sharp, and A, which is our 6th chord. 3 going to 6, cycle of falling fifths. I've talked about that at length in my videos. Neighbor tone here in the alto, and then we have not E major like we would expect, E, G sharp, C sharp, and B. So it's kind of an interesting chord here where we have 3, 6, 5, C sharp minor 7 over E. And this is the interesting chord progression that I was talking about at the beginning of the video, because we have some passing tones in the lower 3 voices here with D natural as well. F sharp, B, and B, which is a passing B minor 7, or sorry, just a B minor chord in first inversion. So 3, 6 going to 2, 6, some interesting adjacent harmony here. Typically we would expect 3 to go to 6. Here we see transitive harmony, almost like F sharp is being surrounded by its minor dominant. I don't think that that's what's happening, but it is interesting to see 6 sort of quasi-tonicized by its the fact that its dominant is being used here, but there isn't a leading tone to make it have that dominant quality. But interestingly, we have 2, 6 take us to A major, C sharp, E, A, and C sharp, which is 1, 6. So just a series of first inversion adjacent triads, which is a pattern that I remember learning about in harmony class, where we'd have a bunch of planed 6 chords. Well, they're not technically planed the same way that you would see in, I don't know, like impressionist music or something like that, but planed from an analytical standpoint, a bunch of 6 chords in ascending or descending configurations. But after our 1, 6 chord, we have some non-chord tones in the outer voices before we get C sharp, E, A, and E, which is our tonic triad again in first inversion, no need to reanalyze. Then we have D, F sharp, that same A, and D in passing, which is like a passing 4 chord, D major. That takes us to, again, another really interesting chord here. We have not E major like we would expect, but rather C sharp minor, E, G sharp, E, and C sharp. So rather than B, we see C sharp. That would be 3, 6, which then takes us off of the harmonic rhythm to D, A, F sharp, and C, which is D major 7, which is a 4, 7 chord, which then takes us to E major, E, G sharp, E, and B. This A is a 4, 3 suspension over our dominant. It's very common for us to see 4-3 suspensions over our dominants in root position especially. And E is a chord tone, G sharp is a chord tone. That takes us to A major, which is our tonic triad in root position, A, E, C sharp, and A. And that's going to be today's analysis. All in all, fairly straightforward, like I said. A couple of quirky progressions. I think the introduction of 3 as a chord in the latter part of the chorale, sort of as a substitute for 5 in pretty much every case, is really interesting. 3 and 5 are similar due to the fact that there is two shared tones, or there are two shared tones between chords that are a third apart. But because E, it's E, not E, I was saying 3 is, it's an interesting chord because it has the leading tone in it, but doesn't really have a dominant quality. It's a chord that sort of gets shafted in terms of its use because it's like a stable chord with the leading tone. It's kind of like an awkward chord, functionally speaking. It doesn't really fit into the narrative. So when we do see it as a passing chord, it's usually part of a cycle of falling fifths configuration, or used sort of as like a pre-dominant. So like we have it like often in front of 4, especially 4-6, and which will then sort of take us to a dominant situation like this. But every time it pops up, I think it's an interesting little addition to the chorale. It's definitely the chord that gets the least amount of usage and recognition in Bach's chorale writing. So I think there's definitely some scholarship to be done in terms of looking at the usage of 3 in the harmony and whether or not there's any convention to it, because it's not really something I've been tracking very judiciously. But yeah, I'd say that might be the big takeaway from this chorale, other than the adjacent harmony we have going on here and the fact that there's a 2-to-1 progression. But I'd say that this 2-to-1 progression isn't as interesting as others in the past because it is part of a greater adjacent progression of, chords just scaling down the scale, just 3-2-1, working their way down progressively. But on that note, I think I'm going to cap the video off. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.